The BMA and NHS Employers have announced important changes to the GP contract for next year. In this short video, Dr Lawrence Butman, Chairman of the BMA's General Practitioners Committee, discusses what these changes will mean.
Dr Butman, can you explain in simple terms what these changes involve?
I suggest that every practice and every GP reads my letter very carefully. This is a very complicated arrangement. In simple terms, the money that comes in, assuming the DDRB give us a pay rise, the money that comes in will be divided into different funding streams, and we've agreed this with the departments and the NHS employers, that we will receive money in proportional terms. So money will be paid in different proportions to global sum, correction factor, QOF and enhanced services. As a result of that, everybody will receive some payment, but nobody will have money traded off between correction factor and global sum as happened last year, and assuming we get any money, everybody will see a rise in their income from where they are now.
A ratio formula is being used to determine the pay awards. Is this the first step on the road towards doing away with MPEG altogether?
We're trying to reduce the reliance of practices on MPIG. We're not doing away with MPIG. We have an agreement that MPIG will remain forever until it's no longer required. And what we have to have is a situation where practices stop losing money, where they are able to increase their income in various funding streams, whilst making sure that global sum is growing in a way that eventually would buy people out of MPIG. That was the original idea. The fact is the government hasn't put any money into global sum for such a long time that it hasn't grown properly. So we now want to see money growing across the funding streams so that people receive an income rise, and we believe this will do that.
Lots of practices are heavily reliant on MPEG. Are there going to be any GPs who will lose out because of this?
Nobody will lose in cash terms. Clearly we've all lost against inflation, our expenses have increased, and we haven't had a pay rise for years, so every one of us, me included, has more financial embarrassment than they had 4 years ago. So no one loses in cash terms, but they clearly have lost against inflation. In money terms, however, assuming we get a pay rise from the DDRB, this will be part of a pay rise, an increase in practice resource. Nobody can lose because nothing is being taken away, unlike last year when money was, at least in theory, put in and taken out in one go, and most people therefore stood still.
You've explicitly said in your letter to GPs that the changes to prevalence means there will be some winners but also some big losers. The BMA is the GP's trade union, yet you seem to have agreed to something that will leave some members significantly worse off. Is that true?
The prevalence adjustments were brought in very early on in the lifetime of QOF because the Conference of Local Medical Committees, and indeed many GPs, felt it wasn't fair that practices should start off creating a QOF system and not receive money for it, even if they didn't have many patients who had the qualifying illnesses. That time has passed now, and the adjustments that happen with QOF in the prevalence arena actually are now seen by many as unfair. The Conference of LMCs wants them to go. Most LMC members want them to go, many GPs think they're unfair, and the government thinks they're unfair, and so do we. They'll be dealt with in two instalments. First, the square rooting, which means that practices that have larger or smaller numbers of people with a particular illness actually don't receive much reward difference between them, depending on how hard they work, and that just doesn't seem fair. And in the second instalment, in a year's time, the 5% front loading, which is money designed to support practices that have very small numbers of patients with qualifying illnesses, that will go as well. Now that has actually proven to be very unfair because it's tilted the way all practices receive their money. So in future people will receive the amount of money based on the number of patients they have with a qualifying illness, and that does seem fair, much more workload reflective, and will actually put money into practices that are looking after large numbers of sick people, which again was the idea it should have been in the first place.
What should a practice do if it thinks it's going to be adversely affected by these changes?
We know that the number of practices that will have a serious problem and be considerable losers are about 140 scattered across the UK. Most of them, not surprisingly, look after patients with small numbers of qualifying diseases, and they tend to be practices that look after large numbers of young healthy people. Those practices are in PCTs who know who they are, and they should contact their PCT and say, we need to preserve our income, how can we do that? And the PCTs are being instructed by the government to be understanding about the provision of locally enhanced services, and the making availability of national enhanced and directed enhanced services to those practices. Many of the practices that look after young healthy patients are university practices, and they offer care in a variety of ways to their patients, which is different to the practices that don't have such patients. They have extra clinics for sexual health, mental health, and a variety of other things, and those clinics could be funded through a locally enhanced service. The PCT is going to be keeping the money, so there is no strong argument for the practice not being able to access a locally enhanced service rather than the QOF income. Fairness for all the other practices in the UK does not mean unfairness for those practices who've been very well supported up to now, but it's, I'm afraid, time that the prevalence adjustments go. They will go gradually. In the first year, losing the square rooting probably won't affect many practices. People will just notice a change in the way the money is distributed. But the second year, where the 5% front loading disappears, that is going to make a big difference to a number of practices. Some practices are going to gain money, quite a lot will gain some money, because the distribution of how many sick people there are will change when there is no 5% preferential front load. And obviously the people who've been getting substantial preferential support up to now are about to lose it. They should contact their local medical committee and seek further advice, and where there are groups of practices that are so affected, it would make much more sense for the local medical committee to work with the practices in discussion with the PCT.
There will be some people who say that this is a compromise too far and that you should have stood up to the government a bit more on this issue. What would you say to them?
As far as prevalence is concerned, I don't see this as a compromise. This actually is a move towards fairness for all practices, and for the doctors who look after large numbers of sick patients who've been adjusted away from up to now. Most GPs recognise that the prevalence adjustment was a relatively medium-term measure and was never going to go on forever. Standing up to the government wasn't going to make them change their minds. It was only a matter of how this was done. This is a redistribution, and that redistribution is down to the profession. And the profession has to stand towards fairness. As far as MPIG is concerned, and the accusation that somehow we've not stood up for that, MPIG was also transient. Clearly it's been much less transient than the government originally envisaged, and the government have tried every way they can to threaten to remove it quicker than we would have liked. We have to find some way of enabling practices to receive the just rewards for their labours. Most practices, just like mine, receive correction factor, and many practices, just like mine, would have serious financial difficulty if MPIG disappeared. But the correction factor mitigates against adjusting income to the workload of the patients we have in front of us and cements in historical unfairnesses. We don't actually understand what those unfairnesses are, because it's quite obvious that whether you receive an MPIG or not is nothing to do with whether you look after poor people or rich people, or you're an efficient practice or an inefficient one. We don't understand what correction factor means. We know what it is, but not how we got to it. And the government and NHS employers are as keen as we are not to do something terribly sudden, because it's obvious that if we do that, large numbers of GPs, including me, are going to be in deep trouble. So therefore, the idea of a differential uplift to income, so that we all get a pay rise, but not necessarily as much as each other, and that this is dependent on how much correction factor we have, seems to me to be fairer than a system where MPIG just disappears and we don't know what will happen then, or some other adjustment imposed by the government. It's taken us a long time to reach this position. Some would argue it's a compromise, some would say it's a compromise too far. I actually think it's fair for doctors and the patients they look after. We ought to be paid for the workload that we have, not cemented into historical unfairnesses. Remember, the Red Book was very unfair in many ways. That's why we moved from the Red Book. Recruitment was terrible. That's why we moved to a new contract which included a global sum. And if the global sum would not have been messed with, we'd all be on global sum now. There wouldn't be any correction factor. So I think what we have to do is say this is not a compromise. This isn't some grubby little deal. This is an arrangement for moving from where we are to some other place without cutting our gross income. And that's what we've managed to achieve. Obviously, an increase in gross income is dependent on the review body, but it's always been like that, and so it will be like that this year. Let's hope they give us a decent sum.